Yes, for this second semester of the Humanities course at UPR Mayagüez, we are working on the historical part with the book Traditions and Encounter. And part 5 of this book focuses on the origins of global interdependence. The book really gives us a sense of global history by visiting every continent at each age that we focus on. The age of global interdependence covers a period of 300 years from the year 1500 to the year 1800. So this part really focuses on the regions and continents of the world as they transform and evolve in the early modern era. This era, early modern era, is often is understood to be the era that actually precedes modernity, namely the 300 years before the year 1800, which is the beginning of modernity. This period of 300 years is largely organized around a major event that happens at the end of the previous century. As we know, in 1492, when the first of Columbus' maritime expeditions arrives in the Caribbean from Spain, and thus connects the world of Eurasia and Africa with the Americas. This exposition itself was part of a whole series of maritime navigations that intended to reach the Orient, namely India and Japan, by sea instead of land. The main merchant route was from the Mediterranean through Arabia and then to India. So the attempt was really to reach the same destination, but by sea. And the Columbus expedition was different from other expeditions like the expedition of Vasco da Gama and Diaz, who were trying to get to India by circumnavigating Africa. In that, Columbus said, well, if it's true that the earth is spheric, then I should be able to travel west and then reach the extreme Orient or the East. And it was, of course, based on this correct idea. The incorrect part of his idea was that he had no awareness that he would actually encounter a whole nother continent, the Americas, and eventually there would be another entire ocean before one would reach Japan. And of course, the expedition was a result of the desire for profit of the crown of Spain. And it was also really an emanation of the expansive mentality of the Renaissance that helped people of Europe lose their fear of God and develop more desire for love, for expansion, for exploration, and for connection. We have to remember that complex societies existed on all continents. And in fact, in part 5, we explore all these 5 continents, including the first chapter of part 5, which is about trans-oceanic encounters, the second chapter of part 5, which is about the transformation of Europe, the third chapter of part 5, which is about the new worlds and how they were affected by the arrival of the Europeans, and the fourth chapter of part 5, which is about Africa and the Atlantic world, how what happened in the Atlantic impacted the continent of Africa. And then the fifth chapter, which is really about East Asia, and the sixth chapter, which is about the Islamic empires, which were both less affected, but in some ways they were affected as well. So in a nutshell, our focus will be what is often known as the Colombian Exchange. This is something very complex, and we're going to explain it briefly here. The Colombian Exchange is whatever was the effect of the encounter of the New World in the realm of plants, animals, bacteria, often those who bear diseases, and also human communities. It's really difficult to have the sense of the entity of this exchange, but it was huge. And just a few examples will help us understand the magnitude. we often look at, think for a moment of the image of your typical German meal full of potatoes, right? German people, also Irish people, are known for loving potatoes. Think for a moment of the famous Indian chief riding on a horse with his pelted, plumed headset. Think of Italian family eating spaghettis with tomato sauce. Any of these staple images of our world would be impossible without the Colombian Exchange. Why? Because the Germans wouldn't have potatoes. All tubers were a New World type of plant. The Indian chief wouldn't have a horse because horses did not exist in the Americas. They were imported from Europe. And Italians wouldn't have tomatoes for their spaghetti sauce. So if you see how really our world is a result of this Colombian exchange, you get a sense of that. So we can say that up until 1500s, there were sporadic contacts between these different parts of the world. But between 1500 and 1800, they become frequent and they become even regular. And just to introduce some of the main concepts that our chapters will revolve around, here it is. The colonization of the Americas, the Atlantic slave trade, the formation of absolutist monarchies in Europe, plantation economies, especially in the New World, eventually the industrial production, and religious change, religious reform. And so, in a way, the Colombian Exchange is the complex of changes and transformations that eventually lead up to the end of the 18th century, which culminates actually in the French Revolution, which is, in a way, what begins the era of modernity, because after the French Revolution, the world is again deeply transformed. Okay, so the first chapter of this part 5 of the book Traditions and Encounters is dedicated to trans-oceanic encounters and global connections. So really the focus is encounters across oceans and the global connections that those encounters established. And there are 3 parts. One has a focus on the explorations that led to these encounters. 2, on the types of trade empires that were established. And 3, on what was exchanged. Okay, so first we focus on the explorations of oceans and the establishment of maritime routes and connections. Here we have map 1 for this chapter, and in this map we see the routes of 3 explorations, 3 voyages of exploration. The one by Bartolomeo Diaz, which really leads from Portugal or Spain to the tip of Africa, the southern tip of Africa, and therefore reveals the extent, the large extent of this continent, how big Africa really is. Then Vasco da Gama continues from that cape and continues to navigate through the Indian Ocean and eventually reaches the south tip of India. So a maritime route is established with this voyage to reach the Indies from Europe by sea and not by land. But Columbus had a better idea. He would follow the scientists of the time who made the hypothesis that the earth was spheric, that it was made like a ball. And so he felt, well, if it is spheric, then if I navigate toward the west long enough, I will reach the Orient. And of course, he was correct in that hypothesis, but he couldn't have imagined that there would be a whole nother continent in the middle, the Americas, and a whole nother ocean, the Pacific Ocean. Obviously, many of these explorations were motivated by the desire to reach India by sea as an alternative route to the route by land that went through Arabia. And so this famous accident of Columbus, or mistake, that connected Eurasia with the Americas had so many consequences for the populations of the Americas, of Europe, and of Africa. As we have seen some of the motivations. Obviously, the motivation for trade is gain, but there's also a more profound motivation, and that was the loss of fear of God. With the cultural movement of the Renaissance, people started to really look more expansively at the world around them. And so that what ensued was a desire for expansion, a desire for expression, for exploration, and for connectedness. What were the means of this navigation, the technologies? Two instruments were very important, and they actually came from China. The magnetic compass is like a ball, and then in the middle is a needle, and this needle is connected with the magnetic fields of the Earth, and so it always indicates the north. Another instrument was the astrolabe, which is an instrument that by looking at the sun enables sailors to measure the distance from the North Pole. How close are we getting to the North Pole? Okay. The type of navigation was with ships called caravels and other types of ships, but they were all propelled by the wind, because they were sailing ship. They had sails, and the wind would blow in the sails. So the sails could be shifted so as to really follow the direction indicated by the compass. So then we get to map 2 of the explorations, and this reflects a later age. The exploration of the Pacific started in 1519 and really was completed only in 1780. Magellan's circumnavigation of the Earth was the first step. And once the circumnavigation had happened, then all the explorations of the Pacific were possible, and the main explorer there was Captain Cook. So the explorations involved Australia, the Pacific Islands, and also South America. The other area that we focus on in this chapter is the types of trade empires. We've seen that one of the motivations was trade and therefore gain, but how does this trade? How does the trade evolve? Especially in the countries of Asia, Southeast Asia, India, China, the style of colonial domination that prevails does not involve conquest or administration of territory. It is more like the development or the enhancement of trading post cities that are placed along the coast. It's a type of colonization that reminds us a bit of the Greek style. Remember that the ancient Greeks never really dominated the territories where they had colonies, but they had these trading avant-posts, these cities located on the coast that were trading areas. Okay, so what happens in this style of colonization is that the demand at the trade post ends up influencing the production in the territory. And sometimes the focus becomes more meeting the demand for exports than really meeting the internal needs. Okay, so in a way, the trading post has an effect on the territory nearby by often determining or significantly influencing what is being produced in those areas. And here we have map 3 of this chapter that shows how all these trading posts are sparse around the coasts of Asia, Southeast Asia, and India, and these are some of the cities that we know even today. Finally, there's another country that really expands and in this period, but this expansion is territorial, not so much an expansion by sea or by trade sea trade. And this is Russia. Russia was a country of Eastern Europe, and in this period it expands throughout the northern part of Asia, all the way through Siberia, reaching the Strait of Bering that coincides with Alaska. So here we have a country that has a major territorial expansion during this period. Then the third focus is the exchanges. We are going to expand a little bit on the Colombian Exchange because it is the main exchange that of this period. We can consider the Colombian Exchange as, you know, the multiple effects of Columbus' accident or error, namely of being directed toward India and sailing in the right direction, but stumbling on a whole nother new continent, which is one reason why our islands, for example, are called the West Indies, and one reason why our island is called Puerto Rico, because the sailors were anxious to find an anchorage where they can lay down their anchor and get ashore. And when they saw the bay that's near the city of San Juan, they exclaimed, "Oh, okay, Puerto Rico, what a beautiful harbor." And so that became the island's name. So this Colombian Exchange is really a massive exchange of species in all biological realms, including bacteria, plants, animals, and humans. We have already remembered some familiar tropes that are a result of the Colombian Exchange, and often we are not aware of it. A German person eating potatoes, an Italian person eating spaghettis with tomato sauce, a Native American person or chief with a plumed headset riding a horse. All of these tropes would not be possible because the German person wouldn't have any potatoes, the Italian people wouldn't have any tomatoes, and the Native American chief wouldn't have a horse. All of these were exchanged. So we can see how really our world is still a result of the Colombian Exchange. So we can look at some of the details in relation to this. Bacteria, for example, were often exchanged because the populations that encountered each other, mainly, you know, the native populations of the Americas that encountered the Europeans who arrived, had different immunities. They had different endemic disease, and when a disease is endemic, the population has immunity in general, but then some people get it. So the same pathogens could have a very lethal effect on a population that didn't have immunity for them. And this happened, for example, in the case of smallpox, a disease that in Spanish is known as viruela, that is a lethal disease, and that the European population had immunity to, even though it was carried and existed at an endemic level. So when this pathogen reached the populations of the America, and especially the populations of the Caribbean, it really had a very lethal effect on them. It decimated, together with many other factors, including the attempts at enslavement and other type of predatory behavior that the Europeans displayed, especially the conquistadors from Spain, toward the native populations of the Caribbean. In fact, there is an estimate that 4 million people lived in the Caribbean archipelago before the arrival of Columbus, and unfortunately, only 40 years later, apparently only about 30,000 were left. The main population, of course, of the Caribbean was the Taínos, but there were other small populations. And in fact, the behavior of the conquistadors against these people was totally predatory, and it really displayed a total inability to comprehend what they were about and, you know, what principles, what belief systems governed their lives. How did the Colombian Exchange affect human populations, as we have seen, through pathogens? But then it really created, it affected a whole range of different populations. It affected the conquistadors who came from Spain and Portugal, who were able to, conquer a whole lot of land and resources and appropriate them and often devastate the areas where they arrived. Population of settlers that came usually from England, especially for religious reasons, groups that didn't really want to subject themselves to the Anglican Church, the Church of England, like the Puritans, for example. It affected the populations of Africa with the mass of deported captives who were then enslaved, who were shipped like cargo to the New World, and those who did arrive and didn't die in the process were then enslaved and made to work in the plantations of the New World. The decimation of natives, as we have seen, by the very cruel and devastating hand of the conquistadors, and also by diseases, and then eventually immigrants, all those people who eventually came to the New World at a later time, when things were already somewhat organized to work in it. So the second chapter of this part 5 of the book, Traditions and Encounters, which is dedicated to the age of global interdependence. The second chapter is about the transformation of Europe. How did Europe transform? Partly, at least, as a result of this encounter with the New World. There are transformations, very significant transformations in the area of belief systems and religions, in the area of politics, in the area of economics, and also in the area of science, modes of knowledge, and the parallel movement of the Enlightenment. So let's look first at the area of religion and belief systems. One could say that this was an age where people desired more opening to spiritual diversity. Namely, many of them were looking for a faith that would be more authentic, more genuine than what the central institution of Christianity at that time, the papacy or the Vatican, seated in Rome, could provide. And so there was a certain turmoil that came from this desire, but then what really coalesced into a movement was a particular practice that was considered very inauthentic, especially in the counties of Northern Europe, areas like what today is Germany. And this practice was the sale, the famous sale of indulgences. What is an indulgence? An indulgence is a sort of pre-signed pardon that somebody with wealth, with enough wealth to make a big donation to the church, could acquire even before whatever sin that indulgence was for would be committed. And obviously this is very inauthentic, because in the Christian faith we know that what warrants forgiveness is repentance, but one cannot repent for something that one hasn't done yet, and if then one does it, clearly the repentance hasn't happened. So this practice of selling indulgences really allowed rich people, with wealth, to buy their salvation, to buy their status in the church, and it often had another side effect that was not very favorable, especially to the Christian communities of Northern Europe, because a lot of the money of these big donations that came from the sale of indulgences didn't stay in the parishes where it was donated, but rather it was shipped to Rome, because at this time the Vatican really wanted to become one of the major patrons for the arts of the Renaissance, and so needed a lot of funds to build, say, the new Basilica of St. Peter's, the tombs of the various popes, calling in the major artists, and so on and so forth. So this desire for patronage and for a certain magnificence in the central institution of Christianity is really what motivated the Vatican to collect all these donations from the indulgences. So one of the pastors of Wittenberg, which is a city in what today is Germany, decided to really move forward and sort of capitalize on this malcontent, allow the energies of protest to coalesce. When he decided to post his 95 theses on the door of the Cathedral of Wittenberg. These 95 theses were posted in a year which is a pivotal date for our course, the year 1517. They were posted to the cathedral, and they really galvanized the protest that was already happening in people's hearts. So this was the the sparkle that ignited what is known as the Protestant Reformation. Clearly, it was a protest against the Vatican as a central institution of Christianity. There were all kinds of protesters. I mean, some people might have been just happy with helping the Vatican reform itself a bit and stop the sale of indulgences, but others really wanted to reclaim the people's magic. They wanted more freer practices of spirituality, and some, especially women, wanted also what today we might call reclaiming the divine feminine, reclaiming the feminine element in the divine. But mostly what prevailed as a result of the Protestant Reformation was that the will of parishes to keep their resources was affirmed, and so eventually when Martin Luther was excommunicated, a new mode of being Christian was established, which was the Protestant mode. And of course, Protestants never really unified in another central church, because precisely they just didn't want that. So that's why we have different groups of Protestants with many different names. But something that really is in common, or was in common at least at that time, was the idea that salvation comes from faith and not necessarily from the good works, especially when the good works are these acquisitions of pardons before the fact. And also so that faith alone is sufficient. So if you're poor but you have faith, there is no prejudice against you. Then the idea that the faithful have a right and a legitimate desire to really educate themselves about their faith by accessing the scriptural texts of this particular faith. And so a lot of effervescence at this time about translating the Bible from the church language of Latin into the modern languages, so that people with access to book and with access to literacy could actually read what was in this document. And also the idea that when there is faith, that direct relationship with the divine powers is actually a very good thing. Something that many practices of Catholicism try to always farm out to the priestly class through the sacraments, right, to always intermediate via the church all these moments of faith. Now for Protestants, this direct relationship with this force, that power of the divine, is considered a good thing. So one can talk directly to God, one doesn't have to talk to a priest. Of all the other groups that established themselves as Protestants at this time, we are going to mention only one, actually. Calvin was a preacher, and his ideas had a lot of success in Switzerland and then in the Netherlands. One of the main points that he made went even beyond Luther in saying that faith alone was necessary for salvation and that donating money to the church was not necessary, in saying that salvation is based on predestination. So some people are born to be saved and some are not. So in a way, it doesn't matter how many indulgences you buy. And one of the Calvinist beliefs was also that this predestination manifested itself via success in earthly endeavors. So clearly the new class of merchants that was developing, especially in the Netherlands, with the new colonies, felt that, if they were successful as merchants, that could be a sign of their predestination, and definitely they liked it. Another area of change is is, we can focus on by observing what happens in England. In England, there really wasn't a major movement for Protestant Reformation, but the King of England, Henry VIII, needed to change wives because he needed a male heir. We know that in most monarchies of Europe, the crown goes from male to male, and he didn't have a son, so he wanted to try with a different wife if he would get one, but the Vatican would not allow a divorce. And therefore, the King of England decided that he was going to simply split from the Vatican and decide that the King of England was also the supreme leader of the Church of Britain, of the Church of England. So this is known as Anglicanism. The form of Christianity known as Anglicanism is basically very similar to Catholicism, but the leader, the supreme leader of the Church, is the King of England. And I said the word Catholicism. We have to remember too that up to this time Catholics didn't exist because everyone was Christian, right? Now that the Protestants have defined themselves as different from those who still follow the Vatican, that's when the word Catholic comes into use to indicate those who have stayed with the Vatican, those who have taken the right way. That's the meaning of the word, but it affirms the idea that some Christians remained faithful to the Vatican. So now we look a little bit at the political transformations over this period of 300 years. They're gradual, but they meander a bit, but the overall direction is very clear. And so we move from Europe being organized around a central institution, the Holy Roman Empire, which is an institution that dates from the Middle Ages and was founded in the year 800 and was still a legacy of that time, to a series of consolidated monarchies, some absolute, like France, some more constitutional, like England, but typically that monarchies that reign over an area that is today known as one of the European states, like France, England, for example, or Spain. Okay, so the Holy Roman Empire, as we remember, was this two-headed empire that had its ecclesiastic center in the Vatican in Rome, and then a sort of secular center was the emperor, who was usually one of the princes of the princedoms of Germany. So it was always a bit of a dysfunctional institution with these two heads. And at the beginning of this time, in the Siglo de Oro, the golden century for the monarchy of Spain, the King Charles V makes an attempt to revive the power of the Holy Roman Empire. How does he do that? Well, we know that Spain is the country that really reaps the most immediate and the most substantial profits from the discovery of the New World and from its many New World possessions. So much so that King Charles V could say that on his empire the sun never set, because it was always a colony that was in daytime. Okay. Then he offers the Vatican to host the tribunal of the Inquisition. Clearly, the Vatican managed to sort of address the issues of the Reformation, and one of the emanations of that was the company of the Jesuits, who really educated the Christians that had remained with the Pope in the faith, and also the tribunal of the Inquisition for those who didn't want to be educated, for those who kept straying and having ideas that were not acceptable to the Vatican. They would be persecuted as heretics. So this tribunal was hosted by the monarchy of Spain. And then creating a political alliance with the House of Habsburg, which was a very powerful house in Central Europe that had given the Holy Roman Empire many emperors. So this was Charles V's attempt. The Inquisition actually expanded well beyond Spain and was a very significant force in this period that really that persecuted those with those who desired to reclaim their magic and really reclaim their own spirituality in very cruel ways by burning them at the stake and so on and so forth. But the attempt of Charles V to revive the Holy Roman Empire didn't really have much of a success. Because history, in a way, the tides were moving in a different directions, and so these monarchies that reigned over a certain area that today is known as one of the countries of Europe started to prevail. So we look at two examples. One, the monarchy of England, which was more of a constitutional monarchy, and then the monarchy of France, which was an absolute monarchy. We take a very quick glance at what happens in these countries in relation to these monarchies. Well, in England, already in the 17th century, we see that there is a very significant protest that is at the same time a protest of faith and also a protest of two social classes opposing each other. The people versus the nobility versus the aristocracy. This is known as the Puritan Revolution. We often think of Puritans as pilgrims, religious dissenters who came to the shores of North America to practice their religion. But in reality, in England, the Puritan Revolution was also a revolution of the working class, of the people, versus the more parasitic class, and a class that they perceived as very frivolous, a class that exploited other classes with its parasitic way of life, which was the aristocracy. And the people perceived that the monarchy supported this class, so they beheaded Charles I, the King of England. The whole royal house exiled itself to France, and William Cromwell took power from 1648 to 1660. Eventually, Cromwell was defeated and the king returned from France. And at this point, the monarchy felt that it would become more stable if it had some allies. And so it became more of a constitutional monarchy. So it learned its lessons early on, which was not the case for the monarchy of France. When we talk about absolutism, what are we talking about? Today, when democracy is more prevalent as a form of government, we grant democracy by dividing the three major powers of government. What are these powers? The legislative power, which is in the hands of Parliament. They write the laws. The judicial power, which is in the hands of the courts, decide who has followed the law and who has not. And then the executive power, which is really the government proper, which is the body that executes the laws. The laws that are written have to be then implemented. So in an absolute monarchy, all these powers are in the hands of the head of state, who is the king. Okay, so there is no division of power, and clearly the power of government can be practiced very arbitrarily, because if I don't like somebody, I'll make a law that says this person is wrong no matter what they do, and then I'll get the judges to put them in jail. So it is very ridden with what is often known in Spanish as personalismos, namely a sort of personal attitude, conspiracies, and all kinds of things that are ad hominem, that address that are hostile individually to particular persons. So absolutism is not a very good way to run a monarchy, but it was practiced in France, and it had. And at some point, it did manage to bring stability to the country. This happened under the reign of Louis XIV, who was also known as the Sun King, Le Roi Soleil, and reigned for a very long time, from 1643 to 1715. 15. So both his long reign and his skill, his abilities as a king, made absolutism capable of giving the country a certain stability and also a certain ways to evolve. And how did Louis XIV do that? Well, he was very well aware that the aristocracy, the noble families, were a parasitic class. They were a class of landowners that had become privileged in the previous era by owning large pieces of land, and they were not productive. They didn't work. They were not entrepreneurs who would put their capital into doing something. So they were totally parasitic, and they weren't even good at administering their own lands. So what Louis XIV did is he had this huge court built, a huge royal palace and many, many buildings and gardens for the court in the town near Paris called Versailles. And today, if you go to France, you will for sure. If you go to Paris, you can visit Versailles and look at this opulence, this magnificence, this enormous court. So, having built this huge court, he invited all the aristocratic families to live at the court at his expense. So with this, what he achieved is that he took them out of their lands because they were not very good administrators for their lands. Of course, he paid for all their expenses, but then he got a chance to send teams of administrators directly to the counties of France and to also hire very good ministers who would really coordinate these administrations. He had two ministers, Mazarin and Richelieu, and precisely they were at the court, but they were directly connected with the local administrators of the counties of France. So in this way, having gathered the aristocratic families at the court, the administration of the absolute administration of the monarchy was able to encourage and to support those new emerging classes, the classes of merchants and entrepreneurs and tradesmen that were emerging from the economic change of the era. Okay. So now we're going to look exactly at what are the economic changes. First, we have to note that there are new crops coming from the Americas. Two very important that we may mention are the potatoes, as we have seen, and also corn, or maize as it was called. These become staple foods for many populations in Europe, including, as we have seen, the potatoes, especially for Northern Europe. And when there is a staple food that is accessible regularly and is cheap, the population grows because more of the children that are born survive into adulthood and because more children are born. So we observe a significant growth in the population of Europe from 1500s, when there was 81 million people in all of Europe, to 1700s with 120 million. Remember that when we look at these digits, they seem very small to us from the perspective of our era. But consider that technologies and the resources of that era, this is a very significant growth, and in any event, it's a 50% growth in 2 centuries. There was more production, both of new crops imported from the Americas and also production that came from the colonies. This production obviously needed commerce, and especially a large-scale commerce. It was kind of far away, and so people in trade and other people too became more aware of one of the laws of trade, which is the law of supply and demand. If the supply is higher than the demand, then the price of the merchandise will fall. If the demand is higher than the supply, then the price of the merchandise will rise. And so tradesmen and people in commerce tried to regulate the supply and the demand to their own benefit when they could. And also, clearly, there was this new entrepreneurial class that needed capital, namely needed liquidity, needed money to fund their enterprises. So some of the tools of capitalism are established at this time. One of these tools is the joint stock company. The joint stock company. We have talked about these trade post empires, all these cities along the coasts of Southeast Asia and India and China that have an influence, have an effect on the productions of the nearby territory, and in some ways control the territory or influence it at least without actually dominating or administering the territory. So the joint stock companies are the companies that organize the trade from these avant-posts, the trade posts, these coastal cities of Asia, to that organize the gathering of goods from the territories to the trading post, and then the shipment of the goods by sea to their destinations. These are the joint stock companies. Also, we must remember that in older times, artisans, artists, manufacturers, people who made things, who worked for hire, doing things for others, were organized in guilds. Every group had its own guild. If you made baskets, you were part of that guild. If you made some other things, you were part of another guild. And these guilds were a bit like workers' associations that helped people protect their rights. So many of the companies that commerce today, what they do is they use the putting out system. Instead of giving products to manufacture to the people, to the artisans in the guilds, they take them out in the countryside to, say, a family that then products that are semi-manufactured, and then the family completes the manufacture, and then the company comes back and picks up the finished product. So this way, by using people in the countryside for this process, they evade the guilds and the artisans in the guilds that were more based in the cities. Many historians have, but this is a time of prosperity. It's a time of abundance because, the exploitation of the New World pays. And so it's a time when a new wealthy class is formed, especially with merchants. And many women at this time take advantage of the situation and are smart, and they actually become very independent through in the New Age. And many historians have hypothesized that, in fact, the witch hunts of this era, which were very rampant, are a bit of the effect of the fear of these very independent women that prosper from trade. Another important change from an economic viewpoint and also a social one is that we have to consider that capitalism favored nuclear families. The typical family of an agricultural civilization, of an agriculture, rural culture, is a family that is extended. For example, it includes more than 2 generations. It includes the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, single members of the family, the grandchildren, and the whole extended family typically lives in a rural area, and everyone is useful in the busy periods of agriculture. All the arms are wanted at that time, so no one is left behind, and the family is large. Now, with a society that is more dynamic and requires more mobility from people, the nuclear family tends to prevail because it is smaller. It only includes 2 generations, the parents and the children. Finally, we look at the area of science, the production of knowledge at this time. And in particular, what new understanding of cosmology comes into place. Okay, so up to the 1500s, the majority of people still had, saw themselves as, people who lived on the earth, and the cosmology that they imagined around them was based on the one established by the astronomer, the Egyptian astronomer of the 2nd century of the Christian era, named Ptolemy. Okay, how was this cosmology designed? The earth was at the center. Around the earth, which was at the center, there were 9 skies. Each sky had one of the planets, and the third sky had the sun, which in the Ptolemaic cosmology revolved around the earth. Then when we get to the 9th sky, this sky was like a tapestry, and all the stars were pinned to this tapestry. So the idea was that the stars didn't move, and that they were all pinned to this 9th sky. And then when you passed that sky with your imagination, you had to consider that all the rest of the space of the cosmos was filled up by God. So God was always watching, was always present, and there was no escape from his observation. And also this cosmology was very static because the earth didn't move. Okay, so many scientists who started to apply the principles of science, namely empirical observation of some natural phenomenon, and then the development of a hypothesis, maybe this is the cause of this phenomenon, and then an experiment that would prove the hypothesis, say in a laboratory. Many of the scientists that proceeded that way started to observe that this cosmology, perhaps it had worked as a belief system at the time of Ptolemy, but really was not adequate to explain the world with the technologies that were available to the people of this day. For example, the telescope that enabled people to observe the sky, so to find out that in fact the stars were, perhaps were not as fixed as they thought. So the first one who really hypothesized a new cosmology, the Copernican cosmology, was Copernicus, who lived in the Netherlands. And I have here a date of 1543. Copernican cosmology is more similar to what we know. In other words, the sun is the center of the solar systems, the planets revolve around it in orbits, and the sun is only one of many other constellations that, other systems that form constellations and galaxies and so on. So Copernicus was the first to make the hypothesis, which was a big challenge. And because he lived in the Netherlands, he didn't find a lot of opposition from the Vatican because the Netherlands were far away. Galileo was the one who actually started to do all the observations and the experiments. Galileo lived in between the 1500s and the 1600s. He had a very long life, and he was based in Pisa, a city a little bit north of Rome, so under the observation and the jurisdiction of the Vatican in many ways. But he was able to run many experiments with his telescope, observing the sky with his telescope, and also dropping pebbles from that leaning tower that allowed him to observe better how these pebbles would fall down, and therefore study the laws of gravity and acceleration. So there was a double observation of the cosmological gravitation of the planets, and the laws of gravity and acceleration on Earth. And then eventually Galileo was made to recant his theories to save his life from the Inquisition. But he had written a book called The Dialogue of Maximum Systems that had all his theories in it. And his sister, who was a nun, was nice enough to smuggle this book to Northern Europe so that we do actually have his discoveries, even though he had to repudiate everything to the Inquisition tribunal. So eventually, a scientist who lived in the mid 17th century and early 18th century, Isaac Newton, consolidated all this knowledge in the law of universal gravity, which tells us that the mass of the planet that we're on determines our weight by a certain coefficient of gravitation. It's a law that explains why, for example, when the astronauts went to the moon, they could jump, like butterflies, is because the moon has a much smaller mass than the Earth, and therefore the same body on the moon has a much lighter weight. So with this law of universal gravity, finally the new cosmologies were affirmed as the ones that were scientific. So what happened among the intellectuals, the philosophers of that time, who were often obviously from privileged classes because there was no public education, and so only people with a certain privilege had access to literacy and to education, was that they started to think, wow, if we are so good at observing the universe and establishing the laws that govern the motions of planets, couldn't we apply the same method to the study of society and maybe design a society that would work? A society where a king wouldn't have to support all these parasitic aristocrats just to govern his land. A society that would be a little more based on reason and on equity and maybe common sense. So this movement came to be called the Enlightenment. In Spanish, it's known as La Ilustración, the Enlightenment, as a movement of those people who sought to bring light, to our understanding of human organization and the organization of human life and human behavior. And it was a movement, the leaders of the movement were often people from the privileged classes who felt that it was important for the monarchs of the time to be aware of the problems and to maybe do something to remediate these problems, because otherwise some malcontent would fester and eventually it might explode. So their desire was really more to instruct and to advise the authorities of the time for some changes that they believed were important. We will mention only three of these leaders. Voltaire, who was a bit of the flagship of the Enlightenment with his advocacy of reason and common sense. And then Rousseau, who focused more on the relationship between those who are governed and those who govern, and he claimed that there should be a social contract between them, namely that governors should listen to those who are governed and write a social contract, make a pact with them as to what their government would be about and what it would make, the social contract. Rousseau is also known for the theory of the bon sauvage, the good savage. We know that for many Europeans, the people that they found in the New Worlds were simply primitives, savages that they couldn't understand what principles governed their lives and their social organizations, and that the people of Europe were very artificial in many ways. They had very artificial clothing. They didn't live in very natural ways. So Rousseau saw these savages, these indigenous people, as people who were good because they were more natural and more genuine. And finally, we remember another philosopher of this period, Montesquieu. And in fact, we remember him even more because he is part of our readings. And he was an advocate of cultural relativism. Why is cultural relativism important? If you consider that, with these trans-oceanic encounters, people from Europe met people who were totally different from them. If they had practiced cultural relativism, they could have understood these cultures on their own terms instead of measuring them against their own culture and finding them short of something that they didn't have. Instead, lack of cultural relativism or ethnocentrism was one of the factors that determined also the cruelty and the extermination of the indigenous people. So cultural relativism really helped in that respect. the Enlightenment, by and large, is a movement that continues alongside the whole 18th century. And it's a kind of lack of listening. The philosophers of the Enlightenment keep trying to get a hearing from the monarchs. You should do this, you should do that, you should do that. Some of the monarchs kind of listen, but then they don't follow up very well. And eventually those who do listen are the people who are affected by the dysfunctions of societies, these absolutist societies. And eventually that's how we end up at the end of the 18th century with the French Revolution, which is this whole other big turmoil that transforms Europe in a very accelerated way again, and begins in 1789.